That night, the old, time-worn walls of Briarwood Hall heard a scream, one that dissolved into the wind, never to be heard again. But the truth behind that scream remained buried. A killer who hid in the shadows, a house shrouded in its own mysteries, and a secret that was always in plain sight, yet no one saw it. Tonight, every old wall, every silent corridor, and every locked door will bear witness to the truths only one person ever knew. But that person is no longer alive. The only question is, are you ready to face the truth? The carriage lurched violently over the uneven cobblestones, each jarring impact swallowed by the relentless wind that howled through the skeletal branches lining the road. Dead leaves, brittle and lifeless, danced in frenzied spirals before settling onto the damp earth, only to be disturbed again by the next cruel gust. A thick mist slithered through the countryside, curling around the wheels and hooves like ghostly tendrils, clinging to the air with an unnatural persistence. And beyond that mist, Briarwood Hall loomed, a silhouette of foreboding stillness against the ink-black sky, its ivy-choked stone walls heavy with the weight of time. The structure did not welcome, it endured, standing in defiance of years and whispers, a relic of a past that refused to rest. Its high, unlit windows peered down, dark and impenetrable, like a watchful presence that bore witness to things best left forgotten. Miss Agatha Marple's carriage rattled to a halt before the estate's towering iron gates, their rusted filigree twisted into a grotesque semblance of elegance. The horse, sensing something unseen, pawed at the ground, its breath curling in the cold air like smoke. Even before she stepped down, Miss Marple could feel it, the oppressive hush, the way the very air seemed to hesitate within these grounds. Silence had a weight, and here, it clung to her like a second skin. The butler emerged from the shadows, his posture stiff, his face unreadable, as if he had long since learned that to express anything within these walls was to invite something unwelcome. He did not bow, he did not greet her beyond the barest nod. He simply turned and led her inside, where the real silence waited. Crossing the threshold was like stepping into another world, one suspended in time, where every inch of space bore the echoes of things unsaid. The manor's air held a strange mix of scents, the aged musk of polished wood, the lingering traces of dried lavender, and something else, something faint, elusive, yet cloying, like the ghost of a perfume long since faded. The chandelier above gleamed, its light refracting across the grand foyer's marble floor, but there was no warmth in its glow. The rug beneath her feet was thick, muffling her steps, allowing the hush to remain undisturbed. A distant clock ticked in slow, deliberate beats, each second stretching longer than it should. Her gaze drifted to the portrait above the grand staircase. It was a massive piece, its gilded frame ornate, though dulled by age. The subjects were two young men, twins, their expressions composed, their attire impeccable. Their smiles were painted with precision, yet there was a rigidity to them, a carefulness that suggested control rather than ease. But it was not them that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was what lurked between them, a shadow, a blur, a presence that should not be there. At first glance, it could be dismissed as an imperfection in the painting's varnish, an old work beginning to decay, but Miss Marple knew better. Someone had once been painted there, someone had been removed, and not well enough. Her fingers tightened around the hem of her coat as a slow chill crept up her spine. She did not believe in accidents. Not after years of watching the smallest, most innocuous details unravel entire lives. She had seen too much, learned too well that what people tried to erase was often what mattered most. She turned from the painting and continued down the corridor, her footsteps swallowed by the deep stillness. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long, lined with more portraits, more faces frozen in time, their painted eyes following her in eerie silence. The air pressed heavier here, the hush thick with expectancy. Then she saw it again, a second painting. The same brothers, but this time, their expressions were subtly altered, tenser, their posture more rigid, and there, looking at the frame's edge, barely perceptible beneath layers of paint, was the same shape. A hand, a face, a figure. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, her breath steady, measured. This was no trick of age. This was deliberate. Something in this house had been hidden, and she had just found the first thread waiting to be pulled. The corridor stretched endlessly before Marple, its silence thick and watchful, as if the house itself was waiting. If there was one thing she knew for certain, it was this: this house had a secret, and it wasn't planning on giving it up without a fight. The heavy oak door at the end of the hallway stood slightly ajar, an invitation or a warning, she couldn't yet tell. The scent of old wood mingled with something faintly metallic, perhaps rust from the iron hinges that groaned whenever the wind pressed against them. But it wasn't just the wind. The manor breathed slow and controlled, like something alive lurking beneath its walls, something patient. Beryl crouched, gloved fingers tracing the doorframe, with the practiced ease of someone who understood that the smallest details often unraveled the biggest lies. The dust here wasn't the careless accumulation of neglect. No, it was finer, almost talcum-like, smeared in deliberate lines just beside the latch. Not a careless touch, an intentional one. Someone had disturbed the door and wanted it to be noticed, or perhaps they wanted it to seem that way. A message, a deception, or a warning. Marple straightened, her gaze drifting to the brass handle, where the dust was carefully arranged just shy of contact. A small miscalculation, or a deliberate sign. She memorized it all, filing it away in her mind like ripples in a pond, subtle disturbances that hinted at something deeper beneath the surface. Too many small signs, too many details waiting to be uncovered. The wind howled through the high windows, rattling the glass as she stepped away from the door, her every movement absorbed by the heavy emptiness of the manor. Every detail stacked, every moment stretched, the tension layering itself like dust settling in forgotten corners. The parlor was warm, its flickering fire casting shifting shadows along the polished wood and plush armchairs. Yet the warmth did nothing to ease the invisible weight pressing against the air. Marple sat at the low, round table, her fingers curled around a porcelain teacup, the scent of strong black tea curling into the silence. Across from her, the Winters family gathered, their presence more formal than familial. Lawrence, the surviving twin, sat beside his wife, their composure too precise for the late hour. Their clothes were impeccable, their expressions rehearsed. Across from them Sir Julian Blake, the family's financial backer, lounged in his chair, his brandy swirling in slow methodical movements. His eyes, though relaxed, were always watching, and beside him Dr. Evelyn Montague, her sharp features betraying nothing but calculation, her thoughts moving in measured, deliberate turns. The conversation in the room was light, but the undercurrent was anything but. There was something forced in their laughter, something too careful in the way their gazes flickered, avoiding contact at all the wrong moments. The silence between their words spoke louder than the pleasantries they shared. "Tell me, Miss Marple," Sir Julian's voice cut through the hush smooth and practiced, the kind of voice that was used to controlling a room. "Do you find these old houses as stifling as I do?" Marple's gaze remained on her teacup for a fraction of a second longer, her fingers tapping lightly against its rim before she met his stare with a quiet smile. "I find them peaceful," she said, her voice soft, deliberate. "But places like this, they have a rhythm of their own, don't they? A way of remembering what others choose to forget." "Walls don't talk," Lawrence chuckled, but the sound was brittle, forced. "Unless you've been here too long, of course." Marple's expression didn't change. "Oh, I don't know," she murmured, setting her teacup down with careful precision. "I think walls remember. A house that has stood this long, it has seen more than we think." The room shifted, the subtle change in atmosphere almost imperceptible. Sir Julian's smile tightened, his gaze flickered, first toward Lawrence then back to Marple. The others said nothing, but the silence in their stillness spoke volumes. "You believe in memories, then?" Dr. Montague's voice was measured, disinterested on the surface, but there was an edge to it, a thread of something sharper beneath the words. Morel tilted her head slightly, considering. "I believe in things that refuse to be forgotten," she said simply. And in that moment she knew, this house wasn't just holding its breath, it was waiting for someone to listen. The heavy stillness of Blackthorn Manor was deceptive. Silence draped over its grand halls like an oppressive veil, but beneath it, something stirred. Inspector Eleanor Graves stood at the threshold of the library, her sharp eyes tracing the flickering candlelight that barely illuminated the cavernous room. The scent of old parchment mixed with the faint tang of something metallic, coppery, unmistakable, blood. The room had been left in perfect order, save for the body that slumped over the grand oak desk, its polished surface marred by a single glistening red stain. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the wealthy and influential patriarch of the estate, had not died peacefully. His head rested at an unnatural angle, his eyes frozen in a final moment of realization. What had he seen before death claimed him? The most chilling detail, however, was the door. It remained bolted from the inside. There was no forced entry, no shattered window, and no signs of struggle, a perfect locked room mystery. But Eleanor knew better. Perfect crimes did not exist. Shadows danced across the towering bookshelves, their looming presence adding weight to the uneasy hush that had settled over the house. The gathered family members lingered outside the library, their expressions carefully composed masks, yet their hands fidgeted, gloved fingers clenching, arms folded too tightly, glances exchanged like whispered secrets. The air between them felt stretched, fragile, as if a single word might shatter the brittle illusion of calm. "Curious," Eleanor murmured, stepping further inside, her gaze sweeping over the small scattered clues the room offered. A book pulled halfway from the shelf, a snuffed-out candle near the window. And then there was the chair, overturned, as though someone had risen too quickly, or had been startled by something, or someone. Her gloved fingers brushed against the desk's edge, finding a thin, almost imperceptible layer of powdery residue near the drawer handle. Not dust, something finer, intentionally placed, a trap or a warning. Before she could investigate further, a piercing shriek shattered the silence, sending a jolt through the tense air. From down the hall, the sound echoed, raw and terrified. A second victim? No, Eleanor recognized the voice. Amelia Hawthorne. Someone had found the truth before she had. The inspector turned sharply, the manor's dim corridors stretching before her, like the gaping maw of something alive and waiting. Whatever game was being played here, it was far from over. The house was holding its breath, and Eleanor intended to be the one to make it exhale. The heavy wooden door of Ashford Manor's study remained bolted from the inside, its iron latch unbroken, untouched, an unyielding puzzle in the face of death. Inspector Evelyn Hart let her fingers ghost over the cold surface, her mind piecing together the impossible. Beyond the door, Lord Sebastian Ashford sat eerily still in his chair, the amber glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows over his lifeless form. His head tilted slightly to the right, his fingers barely curled over the edge of the mahogany desk, as if in the middle of a thought when death took him. No weapon, no sign of a struggle, and yet the undeniable truth of murder lay before them. The air in the room carried the stillness of a place sealed too long, mingling with the faintest trace of something acrid, ink, candle wax, and something else, something just beneath the surface, refusing to be named. Evelyn's eyes flickered across the room, catching the minute details others would have missed. The displaced ink bottle, its contents dripped onto a forgotten letter. The barely discernible scuff on the rug as if a chair had been moved back just an inch too far. Then there was the single book resting against the leg of the towering bookshelf, lying as though it had fallen naturally. But Evelyn knew better. Nothing in this room had happened by accident. Outside in the grand hallway, the Ashford family gathered. their hushed murmurs an uneasy undercurrent beneath the weight of what had transpired. Lady Eleanor Ashford stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly before her, her expression a carefully composed mask of grief. Or was it something else? Julian Ashford, the younger brother, paced near the study's threshold, his fingers tapping an anxious rhythm against his forearm. And then there was Charlotte, the housekeeper, her face ashen, her lips pressed into a thin line as though she had expected this. The constables had arrived, their crisp uniforms too stark against the aged elegance of the manor, their presence stirring the air like a stone dropped into still water. No signs of forced entry, one of them murmured, casting a glance toward Evelyn, locked from the inside, bolted. No other way in or out. A perfect crime, if such a thing existed. But Evelyn knew the truth, perfection in murder was an illusion. Somewhere, hidden among the subtleties of this room, was the answer. Her gaze returned to Lord Ashford's still form, to the untouched brandy beside him, to the cuff of his sleeve where a faint smear of ink hinted at something unfinished. And then, a sound, sharp, sudden, a gasp. It came from the hallway, the family's murmurs ceased, their heads turning in unison toward the source. Charlotte, her hand clapped over her mouth, her eyes wide with something between horror and realization. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "What is it?" Charlotte hesitated, as though something warred within her, something she had not meant to reveal. The house was holding its breath now, waiting. But Evelyn did not wait for answers to come to her. She would tear them from the silence, one thread at a time. Whatever game had been played here, it was far from over. The library at Blackwood Manor was a mausoleum of silence, its towering bookshelves casting long shadows against the dim glow of the wall sconces. Inspector Eleanor Graves stepped forward, her sharp eyes scanning the room with meticulous precision. The heavy oak door behind her remained bolted from the inside, its iron latch firm and untouched, a perfect seal, an impossible puzzle. Yet, within this impenetrable space, Nathaniel Blackwood sat motionless in his chair, his lifeless gaze frozen in a moment of realization that never came. His right hand rested limply against the polished mahogany desk, fingers curled just short of grasping the overturned ink bottle beside him, its dark stain bleeding into an unfinished letter. His untouched glass of whiskey stood undisturbed, the amber liquid casting ghostly ripples under the flickering candlelight. It was the quietness of the scene that unnerved her most. No signs of a struggle, no desperate claw marks, no scattered papers. Death had come gently, and yet, the method was anything but kind. Her gloved fingers ghosted over the edge of the desk, her mind already dismantling the impossibility before her. There was dust on the latch, too much except for a single deliberate smudge, as if someone had touched it with careful intent. A mistake, a whisper of carelessness left behind in an otherwise perfect crime. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting to the vast bookshelves that lined the study, their aged spines untouched by the chaos of the moment. But their third shelf from the left, a thin sliver of space where a book had been removed and returned hastily, its alignment just slightly off. Eleanor felt the pulse of revelation quicken. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, hovered near the threshold, her wrinkled hands trembling as she twisted a handkerchief between her fingers. "Locked, Miss Graves," she murmured. "From the inside, just as we found it." The hall beyond was alive with muted whispers. The Blackwood family gathered in uncertain dread. Theodore Blackwood, the heir with a face carved from stone, his blue eyes unreadable. Beatrice, Nathaniel's sister, her usual composure fractured beneath a mask of polite grief. And Henry Alden, the late Lord's business partner, his expression betraying the unease of a man who knew more than he let on. Eleanor turned back toward the room, letting the silence tell its story. There was something unseen here, something that clung to the very air. She moved to the fireplace, the last embers smoldering in the grate, and there among the ashes, a fragment of parchment barely consumed by the flames. She knelt, retrieving the delicate scrap, her breath steady as she read the inked words barely spared from destruction. "He knows, the door will be locked. Trust no one." A slow, knowing smile touched her lips. The locked door was never meant to keep a murderer out, it had been meant to keep a secret in. Eleanor rose to her feet, turning toward the watching eyes beyond the threshold. "The door will be opened," she said, her voice calm but absolute. "And then we will find out who went to such lengths to make us believe the impossible." She cast one last glance at Nathaniel's frozen expression, at the secrets the dead could no longer speak. But Eleanor could hear them, whispering from the cracks and shadows, and she would listen. The halls of Ashworth Manor exhaled silence, the kind that settled in thick, cloying layers, pressing into the very bones of the house. Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood in the grand drawing-room, her sharp gaze sweeping over the assembled figures, each one a portrait of composed distress. The death of Lord Samuel Whitmore had sent a ripple through the household, but beneath the veneer of grief lurked something colder, something calculated. The fire in the hearth had burned, its embers casting weak flickering light against the polished oak paneling. The scent of aged paper and old varnish clung to the air, mingling with something more elusive, the faint trace of damp wool, the whisper of dust disturbed. It should not have been. Eleanor's fingers grazed the back of an antique armchair, her touch feather-light, searching. She began as she always did, with the servant. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Henshaw, who folded her hands together too tightly, her knuckles whitening with unseen strain. "It's a terrible thing, madam," she murmured, her voice brittle. "Lord Whitmore, he was a man of habit, never strayed from his ways, never missed his evening brandy. And yet," she hesitated, glancing toward the heavy mahogany cabinet where the decanter stood, half empty. Eleanor followed her gaze. The crystal stopper was clean polished, too clean. A deliberate attempt to remove traces of something, but poison did not cling to surfaces, it seeped, it lingered. A house like this could not hide its sins forever. "The household," Eleanor said softly, her tone inviting, "before his passing, tell me, was there tension?" Mrs. Henshaw's throat bobbed with a barely restrained swallow. "Between Lord Whitmore and his nephew Mr. Julian, always. The young master was not favored." She chose her words carefully, her gaze darting to the door as if someone might be listening. "Lord Whitmore had his reasons." Reasons, Eleanor thought. The kind a man took to his grave. Moving through the corridors, she absorbed the small betrayals of the house. The grandfather clock had been stopped, its pendulum motionless, as though time itself had recoiled from the moment of death. A single curtain was drawn where the others were open, shielding the moonlight from casting its glow on the writing desk beneath it. Someone had sat there recently, the dust, disturbed, the ink blotter, slightly askew. She found herself in the study once again, her gaze drawn to the grand portrait above the mantel. Lord Whitmore, stern and unyielding, flanked by his brother, long dead, and there, a shadow. A space where someone else should have been. The paint was uneven, a subtle inconsistency in the otherwise masterful strokes. Eleanor stepped closer, her breath steady, her pulse thrumming with the quiet thrill of revelation. A third figure had once been there, now erased by time, or by intent. She traced the edge of the frame, her fingers finding the smallest groove, a place where a plaque had been removed. Someone had tried to erase a person from the Whitmore legacy. But why, and more importantly, who? Eleanor turned as the floorboard behind her creaked. The butler, Holloway, stood in the doorway, his lined face impassive, but his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "Is everything in order, Lady Whitmore?" Her lips curled, just slightly. "Oh, nothing ever is, Holloway." She glanced back at the portrait, the ghost of its missing figure lingering in her mind. But the truth has a way of revealing itself. In time. She walked past him, her steps measured, her mind already weaving the pieces together, the poison, the missing name, the erased figure, a death that had been planned long before the first drop touched Lord Whitmore's lips. She had seen it before, families bound not by love, but by secrets, and secrets, as always, had a way of unraveling. The night had settled heavily over Blackwood Manor, casting long creeping shadows that slithered through the corridors like silent whispers of the past. Eleanor Graves stood in the dim glow of the library's single flickering lamp, her gloved fingers tracing the edge of the heavy oak desk, where just hours ago Edmund Blackwood had been found dead, his body cold, his eyes frozen in an expression of startled realization. The household had quieted after the initial wave of chaos, but the silence that remained was far from peaceful. It was the kind that held secrets in its grasp, the kind that pulsed with the weight of things left unsaid. The scent of old parchment and polished wood, mixed with the faint metallic tang that still lingered in the air, and Eleanor exhaled slowly, her sharp gaze sweeping over the room. Every detail mattered, the misplaced ink blotter, the slight disturbance in the dust along the bookshelves, the half-drawn curtain that allowed just enough moonlight to illuminate the heavy portrait above the fireplace, a portrait of 3 figures. Edmund Blackwood and his brother Charles stood side by side, their expressions unreadable, but there, faint, almost erased, was the outline of a third. A face barely visible beneath years of careful neglect, its features softened by time, but unmistakable. Someone had tried to erase this person from history. The question was why, and what connection did they have to Edmund's death? She moved with quiet precision, her steps soundless against the carpeted floor, as she reached for the frame. The gold trim was worn, but as her fingers traced the edge, she felt something, a groove where something had once been affixed. A nameplate, perhaps, now removed. The sensation sent a familiar thrill down her spine. The past had a way of refusing to stay buried. Her mind sifted through the details she had gathered thus far, the unease among the servants, the stolen glances between Edmund's widow and the estate's reclusive doctor, the way Charles Blackwood had gripped the armrest of his chair when she mentioned the locked study. The lock, that was another thing. It had been secured from the inside, a perfect illusion of impossibility, yet there were details that didn't align. The dust around the latch had been disturbed, not in the way one might expect from careless handling, but deliberately, methodically. Someone had ensured that the disturbance seemed insignificant, that it blended in with the natural order of things. But Eleanor had learned long ago that order was often just a well-crafted deception. She turned her attention back to the desk, her hands moving with deliberate care as she slid open the top drawer. The contents were arranged with meticulous precision, except for one thing, a small ornate key, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed letters, its delicate engravings twisting in an intricate pattern of vines and thorns. It was a thing of beauty, but also of purpose. Keys were meant to open things, and this one did not belong to the obvious locks in the house. Eleanor turned it over in her palm, feeling the faint indentations where it had been handled many times before. Whatever it unlocked, it was something often used, yet hidden from plain sight. A secret compartment, a concealed passage. Her mind flickered with possibilities, each one painting a picture of a family steeped in deception. As she straightened, her ears caught the faintest creak beyond the library door, a sound so subtle that most would dismiss it, but not her. She had learned to recognize the weight of a hesitant step, the careful shifting of someone who did not want to be heard. She remained still, letting the silence stretch, waiting for the presence on the other side to make another move. And then, just as she had expected, the sound of retreating footsteps, soft, calculated, but unmistakable. Someone was watching her. She allowed herself a small smile, slipping the key into the concealed pocket of her coat. The game had begun in earnest now. There was something in Blackwood Manor that someone had gone to great lengths to hide, and Edmund Blackwood had died for it. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, had a way of surfacing in the end, and Eleanor Graves had never failed to bring them to light. The study smelled of age and silence, thick with the weight of things long unsaid, the walls heavy with the kind of history that did not welcome the prying eyes of strangers. The Blackwell estate was a place built on legacies, on the names that were remembered, and the ones that were buried beneath layers of dust and deceit. Evelyn Carter traced her fingers over the mahogany desk, her touch grazing the uneven surface where papers had once been hurriedly disturbed, shoved back into place without the careful order that characterized a house so meticulously preserved. A single drawer sat slightly ajar, as if someone had hesitated in closing it completely, leaving behind a whisper of their presence. She glanced toward the door, listening. The house had its own voice, the slow groan of wood settling under its own weight, the distant rattle of a loose window pane in the upper floors. But beyond that, there was a silence that carried its own warning. She was alone in the room, but she knew better than to trust the illusion of solitude. With a quiet breath, she pulled the drawer open. Inside, a jumble of documents lay in disarray, ledgers, estate records, forgotten letters that time had yellowed but had not erased. At first, nothing seemed out of place. A collection of financial records, correspondences between past family members, the usual traces of a household that had endured for generations. But as her fingers skimmed through the layers, her eyes caught something that didn't belong, a birth record. It was old, the paper thin and brittle with age, the ink fading yet unmistakable. The name was there, Alexander Blackwell. A chill prickled at the nape of her neck. She had read every family record available, combed through the history of the Blackwells in preparation for this case. There had been no mention of an Alexander, there had only been two sons, Elias and Reginald. But here, in the brittle folds of an old ledger, was proof of a third, a name carefully omitted from the family's legacy, erased with a precision that suggested not mere forgetfulness, but intent. The missing Blackwell, the ghost in the house. Why? She turned the document over, searching for any additional notations, any explanation for why this name had been buried so deeply that not even the whispers of the estate's oldest servants had carried it forward. Nothing. Just the silent condemnation of a name struck from history. But then, a crease along the edge of the page caught her eye, a faint, deliberate fold, as though the paper had once been hidden within something smaller. A compartment, perhaps? A book with a false cover? She ran her fingers along the desk's underside, pressing lightly, feeling for anything that yielded, a soft click. The sound was nearly imperceptible, but she had been listening for it. With steady hands, she pulled at the bottom panel of the drawer. It resisted at first, as though reluctant to reveal its secret, but with one firm motion it gave way. Inside, lying alone in the hidden compartment, was a key, small, ornate. The brass was worn with time and use, its intricate engravings of ivy and thorns winding along the shaft like a creeping secret. It was far too delicate for a door. This was meant for something more intricate, something precious, something forbidden. Evelyn turned it over in her palm, her mind racing ahead to the possibilities. A safe, a locked journal, a hidden passage. The Blackwell estate was vast, its halls stretching like veins through the body of a house that had swallowed generations whole. There were too many places where something or someone could be concealed. She weighed the key in her palm, her mind sifting through the pieces of the mystery, trying to make them fit: the missing name, the erased birth record, the key to something unseen. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this secret buried. Had Alexander been hidden away, or had he disappeared under more sinister circumstances? The Blackwells had always been careful about their reputation. A son who had been erased from history could mean only one thing: his existence had posed a threat. A floorboard creaked beyond the door. Evelyn did not move, did not turn her head, but her senses sharpened. Someone was there, watching. She remained still, letting the weight of silence press against her, waiting to see if they would dare another step. Seconds stretched, the stillness held, and then, just as softly as it had come, the presence retreated. The sound of quiet, measured footsteps dissolving into the long corridors of the house. She exhaled slowly. The key was cold in her hand. Whatever the Blackwell family had buried, it was never meant to be found, but secrets, no matter how carefully locked away, had a way of coming to the surface, and now, with the key in her possession, and a name that should not exist resting on the tip of her tongue, Evelyn knew she was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. And whoever had been standing outside that door, they knew it too. The air inside Blackwood Manor was thick with the weight of forgotten things, the scent of old paper and secrets pressing against the walls like a breath held too long. Eleanor Graves moved through the dimly lit corridors with a quiet purpose, her fingers brushing against the wooden paneling, as if the house itself might whisper its truths, if only she asked the right questions. The caretaker, Mr. Langley, had been careful with his words earlier, too careful. Some say the old servants' quarters lead somewhere, he had muttered, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond her shoulder, voice strained as if he were afraid of being overheard. A passage no one uses anymore. It had been a warning wrapped in indifference, a reluctance too well rehearsed. Eleanor had thanked him, watching as his gaze lingered on the darkened hall behind her before he turned away, his silence carrying a weight of its own. Now, standing in the vast limray, she let her instincts guide her. The towering shelves loomed, the scent of aged leather and dust clinging to the heavy air. She had searched here before, but this time, she was not merely looking, she was listening. Her hands skimmed the spines of books, feeling for anything that resisted, anything that did not belong. A slight misalignment in the shelving caught her attention, a section of wood worn smooth from years of unnoticed touches. She pressed against it, first gently, then with more force, and with a groan, the shelf shifted, revealing a darkened recess behind it. A rush of cool air carried the scent of stone and mildew, the unmistakable breath of a place untouched by time. Eleanor exhaled slowly. This was it. From her coat pocket, she withdrew the ornate key she had found earlier, a delicate thing of brass, its intricate engravings winding along the shaft like vines reclaiming a forgotten ruin. She traced the metal with her fingertips before sliding it into the hidden lock. A click. A door. The passage yawned open before her, a narrow corridor carved into the bones of the house. The walls were stone, damp with the weight of centuries, and cobwebs clung to the corners like the ghosts of things left behind. Her footsteps were soft against the dust-covered floor, each step echoing as if the manor itself were listening. This was no mere architectural quirk, no decorative folly of some long-dead aristocrat. This was built for a purpose. A way to move unseen, a way to disappear. As she moved deeper, the air grew heavier, the silence thick with the suggestion of things unsaid. Her fingers traced the walls, where faint etchings marked the stone, symbols worn by time, barely visible in the dim light. Not random, deliberate. Someone had been here before, and they had left a message only meant for those who knew where to look. Then, just ahead, something caught her eye. A disturbance in the dust, the faint drag marks of something heavy having been moved. She crouched, running her fingers along the floor, tracing the patterns of something being pushed, or pulled, through this very space. Recent enough to suggest activity, old enough to have been ignored by anyone who wasn't searching. Her pulse quickened. This was no accident. The locked room she had been investigating wasn't just a curiosity, it was a key. Not to a crime, but to something deeper, something meant to stay hidden. The passage twisted again, narrowing as if urging her toward its heart. The manor had secrets, secrets it had long since buried beneath stone and silence. But Eleanor Graves had never been one to let the past stay buried, and now, with the key in her possession, and the knowledge that someone had been here before her, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever was waiting for her at the end of this corridor, she was not meant to find it. But she would. Eleanor Blackwood stood at the edge of the abandoned conservatory, the moonlight filtering through the ivy-strangled glass, casting fractured patterns on the floor. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, a forgotten part of Blackwood Manor that had long been swallowed by time. She had arranged this meeting with Vincent Graves carefully, knowing that confronting him outright would yield nothing but well-rehearsed denials. He arrived exactly as she expected, his presence sharp and deliberate, standing just beyond the reach of the dim lantern glow. His hands were in his pockets, his gaze unreadable, yet there was tension coiled in the rigid line of his shoulders. "Miss Blackwood," he greeted, his voice smooth, practiced. An unusual choice of location. Eleanor allowed a small, knowing smile. "I thought it fitting. This part of the house, much like its secrets, has been left to rot." His expression didn't waver, but she caught the slight twitch of his fingers. "You asked me here for a reason. What is it?" She took a slow step closer, her boots making no sound against the cold stone floor. "The passages," she said simply, letting the words hang between them. "The ones that allow someone to move through the house unseen." A flicker, just a flicker, in his otherwise controlled demeanor. "You've been listening to gossip," he replied, but the evenness of his tone was just a little too forced. Eleanor tilted her head, studying him the way a cat studies a trapped mouse. "You knew I'd find them eventually," she continued, her voice soft, almost coaxing, "and you knew the locked door was only a diversion. The real secret is the house itself, isn't it?" Vincent exhaled slowly, as if weighing his options. "You're chasing ghosts, Miss Blackwood," he said at last. "This house is old, the walls whisper, the servants talk. That doesn't make every rumor true." She took another step forward, the flickering lantern casting long shadows between them. "Perhaps. But then how do you explain the worn markings on the stone, the hidden latches, the way the air shifts behind the bookshelves?" She let the silence press between them. "Or the fact that someone has been using those passages?" His jaw tightened. "You're mistaken." Eleanor smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. "Am I?" She reached into her pocket, pulling out the small brass key she had discovered behind the paneling in the library. It glinted dully in the light. His gaze flickered to it. "Quick, but enough." "I believe this belongs to you," she murmured. "Or at least to someone in this house, someone who didn't want it to be found." Vincent's fingers curled into his palm, but his expression remained composed. "You're making dangerous assumptions," he said, his voice low now. "A threat? A warning?" She couldn't be sure. "The truth is often dangerous," she countered. "But it has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried." A long pause stretched between them, the night wind rattling against the glass panes. Then Vincent did something unexpected. He smiled, not the rehearsed, polished expression she had seen before, but something sharper, amused, knowing. "Be careful where you dig, Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You may not like what you find." He turned on his heel, disappearing into the shadows of the manor, before she could say another word. Eleanor stood still, the key cool against her palm. For the first time since she had begun unraveling this mystery, she felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her. Not fear, not yet, but the certainty that the house wasn't just holding secrets. It was watching, and whatever it was hiding, she wasn't meant to find. The study smelled of aged paper and secrets, the weight of time pressing against its thick wooden walls as Helena Dawn laid out the evidence before her. A faded photograph, its edges curled with age, captured a shadow in the background, a presence almost erased, but not quite. A brass key, its ornate design, suggesting a purpose long forgotten, glinted under the dim light of the oil lamp. And then there was the dust, disturbed on the latch of the bookshelf, a door meant to be hidden, now betrayed by the hands that had used it. The house, with all its grandeur, had whispered to her, its secrets bleeding through the walls in murmurs only she had bothered to hear. Somewhere in these rooms, the truth had been waiting, buried beneath years of silence, and now it was clawing its way to the surface. She had arranged the meeting carefully, ensuring there would be no interruptions, no prying ears. The moment Vincent Wren arrived, Helena noticed everything: the precise way he carried himself, the controlled pace of his footsteps, the flicker of hesitation just before he crossed the threshold. He did not sit. Instead he hovered near the fireplace, one hand resting lightly on the mantel, his expression carefully blank. A seasoned liar, then, but even the best of them had cracks. "Miss Dawn," he greeted, voice smooth, practiced. "This is unexpected." Helena allowed a slow smile. "Is it?" She gestured to the items spread across the desk, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of the photograph. "I thought you'd find this familiar." His gaze flickered downward, lingering on the key for just a fraction too long before he forced himself to meet her eyes. "You've been busy. I prefer thorough." She leaned back, studying him the way one might examine a puzzle with a missing piece. "Tell me, Vincent, how long did you think you could keep it buried?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The passages," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, as if speaking the words aloud might summon the ghosts that haunted this house. "The ones that let someone move unseen, the ones that lead to rooms that shouldn't exist." He exhaled, slow and measured, but his fingers curled slightly against the wood. "You're mistaken. No." She reached into her pocket, drawing out a folded letter, the ink smudged, the words faint, but clear enough. "This is from the last person who tried to uncover the truth about this house. You recognize the name, don't you?" His expression did not change, but the air in the room shifted, thickened. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. That's where you're wrong," she murmured. "I know exactly what I'm stepping into. The question is, how far are you willing to go to stop me?" Silence stretched between them, heavy, charged. The fire flickered, casting shifting shadows across Vincent's face, his features unreadable. And then, after a long measured pause, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile that sent a chill crawling down her spine. "Some doors," he said quietly, "are locked for a reason." He turned, walking toward the door with the kind of unhurried ease that only came from someone who believed they were still in control. But Helena knew better. She watched him disappear down the dimly lit corridor, the weight of his unspoken warning lingering long after he was gone. Slowly, deliberately, she turned back to the desk, her fingers brushing over the cold metal of the key. The truth wasn't just buried in these walls, it was waiting, watching. And she was about to unearth it. That night, Helena barely slept. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass as though the house itself was resisting her presence. Somewhere in the corridors beyond her room, a floorboard creaked, a slow, deliberate sound, as if someone were standing just beyond the door. She held her breath, waiting. The silence stretched impossibly long before the noise faded, swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the house. A warning. By morning, her resolve was sharper than ever. The pieces had aligned, the final connections made. She had spent the early hours poring over maps, old blueprints of the estate she had managed to acquire. The passage wasn't just a hidden corridor, it was a network, twisting through the walls like veins, connecting rooms that should never have had access to each other. And then she had found it. A chamber, unmarked, unseen on any official record. She dressed carefully, her movements precise, her mind racing ahead to the moment she would confront Vincent again. The drawing room was as grand as ever, its rich dark paneling absorbing the morning light, giving the space an unnatural weight. The family was already gathered, Sir Julian Blake by the mantel, his usual air of confidence tinged with something more guarded. Dr. Evelyn Montague, ever composed, though the subtle tremor in her fingers betrayed her unease, and Vincent of course seated near the window, the golden light catching the sharp angles of his face. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Dawn," he murmured, "back so soon." She took a seat, crossing her legs with deliberate ease, letting the silence settle before she spoke. I found the chamber. The room seemed to inhale, the air growing thick with a tension that pressed against the skin. Vincent didn't move, but the flicker of something dark passed through his expression, quick, nearly imperceptible, but she saw it. "You've been searching for ghosts, Miss Dawn," he said, his voice cool, measured. "Tell me, did you find any?" She smiled. "I found more than ghosts, Mr. Wren." She leaned forward just slightly. "I found the truth." The room held its breath. Somewhere down the hall, the clock struck noon, and Helena knew that before the day was over, someone in this house would break. The silence settled like a thick fog, wrapping the room in an unease so tangible, it felt like a presence of its own. The candlelight flickered, casting restless shadows along the mahogany walls, stretching and curling like unseen hands reaching for the past. Helena Graves sat composed at the head of the room, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the edge of the polished table. The storm outside howled against the grand estate, as if the house itself was trying to warn them. One by one, the family members had gathered, drawn by the inescapable force of truth that Helena had so carefully unearthed. "Well, Miss Graves," Lawrence Ashford finally broke the silence, his voice rasping, betraying a strain he had tried to conceal. "You summoned us here. Speak your piece." "Patience, Mr. Ashford," Helena replied smoothly, her voice a steady contrast to the storm raging beyond the stained glass windows. "All will be revealed in due time." The tension was a living thing creeping into every hesitant glance, every breath held too long. Sir Julian poured himself another measure of brandy, though his fingers trembled just slightly as he raised the glass to his lips. "Doctor," Evelyn Montrose, her ever-composed exterior beginning to fracture, cast a furtive glance toward Lawrence, her lips parting as if she might object. Then, thinking better of it, Helena waited, drawing out the moment, letting the silence press against them, forcing them to acknowledge the weight of what was coming. She did not move quickly, but with purpose, her eyes sweeping the room, ensuring that each person felt her gaze upon them. When she finally spoke, it was with the calm certainty of someone who had already won. "Each of you has played a role in concealing the past," she began, voice even, deliberate. "But the past has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, no matter how deep it is buried." She turned her gaze first to Lawrence. He stiffened, his knuckles whitened where his hand gripped the chair's armrest. "The first clue," Helena continued, "was in the portrait that hangs in the East Wing, a portrait so familiar, so accepted, that none of you ever questioned what it wasn't showing." She allowed the words to settle before continuing. "At first glance, it is simply a depiction of two brothers, but look the brush strokes at the edge, clumsy, hurried, an attempt to conceal something rather than preserve. A third figure once stood in that painting, a third sibling, erased, but not completely." The air in the room grew heavy, the fire crackled in protest. "Edward Ashford," Helena said, the name slicing through the silence like a scalpel. A name buried in the estate's oldest records, stricken from the family history. A brother no one speaks of, a brother who by all accounts should not exist. A sharp inhale, averted gazes. Helena took her time, letting her revelation fester before pressing further. And then there was the key. She lifted it between two fingers, the tarnished brass catching the low light, small, ornate, easily overlooked, but its purpose, far more significant. She tilted her head, eyes sharp with knowing. It did not belong to a door, it belonged to something hidden, something meant to stay hidden. She let the implications sink in before continuing. A passage built into the very bones of this estate, a corridor unseen, unknown, except to those who needed it. The reaction was immediate, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged between Julian and Lawrence, a twitch at the corner of Evelyn's mouth. Helena pressed on, "And then there was the dust," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "The dust along the latch of the bookshelf in the library, a place untouched for years, except," she let the pause stretch, savoring the suspense, except that someone had disturbed it, recently. She took a step forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor, each sound punctuating the thickening dread in the room. Someone used that passage, moved unseen through this house, and they did so for a reason. The fire snapped loudly, a log collapsed inward, sending embers spiraling. Helena let her gaze sweep the room once more. Victor Ashford was murdered, she said, voice quiet, precise, but not by the obvious hand. Her eyes settled on Lawrence. It was never about Victor, it was never about wealth, it was about Edward, it was about what he knew, what he represented. She let the words settle before delivering the final blow, and someone in this room was willing to kill, to keep that secret buried. The room held its breath. The only sound was the slow rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Each second stretched impossibly long, winding the tension tighter and tighter, and then Lawrence exhaled, a slow measured breath. His mask of indifference fractured, just slightly. Helena's lips curled into the barest hint of a smile. The truth had been set free. Now it was only a matter of who would break first. The air in the grand drawing room had thickened into something almost tangible, a force pressing against the lungs of those gathered. The heavy velvet curtains muffled the outside world, sealing them within this suffocating cocoon of secrets. Miss Evelyn Crowley stood at the heart of it all, her dark eyes scanning the assembled figures with quiet authority. They had come here under the pretense of civility, of closure, but beneath the polished surfaces and measured breaths lay something far more insidious: fear. Lord Alistair Harrington, his whiskey glass gripped a little too tightly, watched her warily. Lady Eleanor's delicate fingers twisted in the fabric of her gown, her composure, an exquisite mask. Dr. Felix Wren sat rigidly, his jaw clenched, while Nathaniel Graves loomed near the fireplace, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his tense expression. Evelyn took a step forward, her presence a ripple disturbing the stagnant air. This, she said softly, was never about inheritance or rivalry, it was about erasure. A silence heavier than stone settled over the room. A person can be murdered in more ways than one, she continued, her voice steady, deliberate. A life can be taken with a blade, with poison, with hands wrapped around a throat, but the most insidious way to kill someone is to erase them, to strip them from memory, to cast them into the void where their existence ceases to matter. Her gaze locked onto Alistair, who swallowed hard but said nothing. This house was built on secrets, she went on, pacing slowly, letting her words settle like dust on forgotten furniture. And one secret above all has remained buried beneath the weight of decades. The true heir, the one who was never meant to return. A sharp intake of breath from Eleanor. A muscle in Nathaniel's jaw twitched. Felix's hands curled into fists. Evelyn allowed the tension to build, to stretch taut like a wire. Then she turned her attention to the grand portrait above the fireplace. It depicted two brothers, the late Lord Harrington and his younger sibling, but Evelyn had seen what others had overlooked. The faintest outline, the whisper of another figure that had been painted over, concealed. There was another, she murmured. A third. The words sliced through the silence. Eleanor let out a strangled gasp. Felix paled, and Alistair took an unsteady step back. No, he whispered. But Evelyn ignored him. Christopher Harrington, she continued, her voice unwavering, the forgotten brother, the one who was supposed to have drowned in the lake all those years ago. But he didn't drown, did he? She turned then, her sharp gaze slicing through the gathered figures. He was locked away. The room seemed to contract, the walls pressing in. The fire crackled, its embers spitting like a pulse quickening in fear. You see, Evelyn said, the truth has a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And then, as if summoned by her words, the door at the far end of the room creaked open. A shadowed figure stepped forward, the flickering light illuminating features that should not have existed, a face that had been consigned to history. Christopher Harrington had returned. A gasp, a choked sob. Eleanor's trembling hands flew to her mouth. Felix stared in mute horror. Alistair turned as pale as death. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same striking bone structure, the same piercing eyes, haunted now, hollowed by years stolen from him. "You lied." Christopher's voice was raw, rasping, carrying the weight of decades in the dark. "You let the world believe I was dead." His gaze settled on Alistair, the brother who had inherited everything in his absence. "You took what was mine." Alistair's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the polished floor, the sound like the snapping of the last thread holding the illusion together. Evelyn's voice cut through the chaos. "And now at long last the lie unravels." The air inside Blackthorn Manor was suffocating, thick with the weight of secrets long buried, yet clawing their way to the surface. The fire in the hearth crackled, its flickering light dancing against the heavy velvet drapes that had been drawn shut, sealing them in this tomb of whispered betrayals. At the heart of it all stood Evelyn Graves, her presence commanding as her eyes moved from face to face, each one carefully schooled, yet betraying the dread lurking beneath. They had gathered here expecting resolution, but what they had found was far more terrifying, the unearthing of something that should have remained forgotten. Lord Sebastian Vale, his hands clasped behind his back, appeared outwardly composed, yet his fingers twitched with an unspoken anxiety. Lady Vivian Harrington sat stiffly, her nails digging into the fabric of her gown. Dr. Ellis Hawthorne's gaze darted to the brandy decanter, as if longing for its solace. And then there was Julian Blackthorne, his usually unreadable face set in an expression of frozen disbelief, his blue eyes locked onto the figure that had just emerged from the shadows. "It was never about the inheritance, was it?" Evelyn's voice sliced through the silence, smooth, deliberate. "It was about erasure." The words sent a shiver through the assembled figures, their breath collectively held as the truth took shape before them. "A person can be killed in more ways than one," she continued, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor. "They can be murdered with a knife, a gun, a carefully administered poison, but the most insidious death, the one that leaves no mark, no evidence, is the death of memory." Her eyes found Sebastian's, and for the briefest of moments something flickered there. Recognition, guilt. "But secrets," Evelyn murmured, "never stay buried." A slow, deliberate creak echoed through the room as the far doors swung open. The man who stepped inside carried with him the weight of a past that had been forcibly erased, his very existence denied. The resemblance was unmistakable: Sebastian's jawline, Julian's piercing eyes, Vivian's delicate bone structure. He was a ghost, resurrected. Alexander Blackthorne had returned. The collective gasp was sharp, slicing through the stillness. Vivian's breath hitched, her trembling hand flying to her lips. Ellis for once was speechless, his medical precision unable to rationalize the impossible. Sebastian took an involuntary step back, his face pale, stricken. Julian did not move. His fingers tightened at his sides, but his expression remained eerily blank, his mind working furiously behind the mask. Alexander's voice, when he finally spoke, was raw, unpolished, like an instrument that had gone untouched for too long. "You let the world believe I was dead." His words were not an accusation, but a statement of fact, one that carried the weight of years lost to silence. His gaze landed on Sebastian, on Julian, before sweeping over them all. "You built your lives upon the foundation of my absence." Evelyn let the silence settle, watching, waiting. "But the truth," she whispered, "has a way of clawing its way to the surface." Julian finally exhaled, the tension in his frame shifting into something else, something unreadable. "Why now?" His voice was quieter than expected, lacking its usual sharp edge. "After all these years, why come back?" Alexander tilted his head, a wry, bitter smile curling his lips. "Because I was never going to stay buried." His voice darkened, "and because someone had to pay." His eyes locked onto Sebastian, who stiffened. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled against the walls of Blackthorn Manor. The lie had unraveled, and now the reckoning would begin. The flickering chandelier cast trembling shadows upon the faces gathered in the dimly lit parlor of Ashford Manor, where the air crackled with tension, thick with the scent of old books, and something else, something metallic, like the ghost of spilled blood. At the heart of it all stood Detective Eleanor Graves, her keen eyes narrowing as she observed the man before her. Graham Ashford, the brother long thought to have been lost to tragedy, now revealed as the architect of a crime that had upended their lives. "You never wanted justice." Eleanor's voice was a blade slicing through the silence, her steady gaze pinning Graham in place. "You wanted to rewrite the past." Graham exhaled sharply, his fingers curling into fists as he stood at the center of the room, every eye on him, their expressions a mix of horror and reluctant understanding. He had hidden in the margins of their lives, erased by time and deception, until tonight, until he chose to step forward and force them all to remember. "You think it was easy?" His voice was jagged, raw with resentment, "to be cast aside, to be nothing but a whisper in the halls, while you all lived the life that was meant to be mine." His eyes flickered toward Sebastian, his elder brother, who stood by the fireplace, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling at his sides. "You never looked for me. None of you did. You let the world believe I was dead, because it was convenient." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her mind piecing together the puzzle with surgical precision. "So you created the perfect crime," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You exploited the hidden passage beneath the old study, the one only you would have remembered. You laced Robert's brandy with digitalis, just enough to weaken his heart, make his death seem natural. And then, when the moment was right, you locked the door from within before slipping out through the passage, leaving no trace." She let the words settle, watching as Graham's breath hitched. "You knew the servants would hear the thud of his body hitting the floor. You knew the family would find him exactly as you planned. A glass of brandy in his hand, a tragic accident, a story neatly packaged." She took a slow step forward, the polished floorboards groaning beneath her weight. "But the dust on the passage latch betrayed you. The hidden world you thought belonged only to you. It remembered." The room held its breath. Graham's shoulders sagged for a fraction of a second, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. But then his jaw tightened, his defiance rekindled. "And what would you have done?" His voice was quiet, bitter. "If you had been forgotten, if your name had been struck from the ledgers, your face absent from the family portraits, your existence denied by those who should have loved you." His gaze flicked once more to Sebastian, who remained silent, frozen in a moment that stretched unbearably. Eleanor didn't flinch. "I wouldn't have murdered my own blood to reclaim my place." Graham let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Then you don't understand, detective. This was never about reclaiming my place." He turned to Sebastian fully now, his eyes glinting with something deeper than rage, something more dangerous. "It was about ensuring you never forgot what you did." A cold hush descended upon the room. "But you underestimated one thing," Eleanor said, her voice almost gentle now. "The truth always finds a way to breathe." Graham's lips parted as if to retort, but then the sound of boots against the marble announced the arrival of the constable, stepping forward from the doorway, waiting. For a long moment, Graham stood utterly still. Then, without a word, he straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and let them take him. As they led him away, the room exhaled, the weight of years of deception lifting, but not entirely. The scars would remain. And as Eleanor watched the door close behind the lost Ashford brother, she knew that the ghosts of this house were not finished whispering yet. The great hall of Ravenshade Manor stood in eerie silence, the weight of its secrets pressing down on those who remained. The air, once thick with tension, now carried the ghostly echoes of a confession that had shattered the very foundations of a family built on deceit. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced across the opulent furnishings, distorting the figures of those left behind, witnesses to the undoing of a man who had fought to reclaim a place he had been denied. Inspector Helena Locke remained motionless by the grand piano, her fingers trailing absently over the polished wood, her sharp mind dissecting every moment of the evening, every unraveling thread of the deception that had been so carefully spun. Across the room, Victor Radcliffe stood near the window, his silhouette outlined against the moonlit gardens beyond, his breath fogging the glass as he stared at his own reflection, the relief of being free from suspicion warring with the deeper wounds left behind. He had been accused, branded the villain of this tragedy, but the truth had exonerated him, at the cost of a brother's disgrace. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I should have seen it," he murmured more to himself than to anyone in the room. "I should have known." Locke turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. "Guilt is an easy thing to claim in hindsight, Mr. Radcliffe, but the truth is rarely so simple." She glanced at the others. Lady Eleanor, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Dr. Whitmore, still clutching his glass of scotch, his knuckles white against the cut crystal, and Cecilia Graves, the youngest among them, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, as if mourning something deeper than the crime itself. The constables had taken Henry Radcliffe away, his once confident stride reduced to something mechanical, hollow. He had fought, had denied, had tried to shift the blame in a final desperate act of defiance, but in the end, the truth had been undeniable. He had poisoned his own father, used the hidden passage behind the study, a relic of a time long past, known only to those who had been raised within the walls of this decaying empire. He had plotted meticulously, chosen his moment with the precision of a man who had lived in the shadows for far too long. And yet, it was the smallest detail that had betrayed him, the dust disturbed on an old latch, the faintest scent of crushed almonds lingering in the air, the way his hands had trembled ever so slightly when the accusations had been laid before him. "We all carry our ghosts," Locke said quietly, stepping forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Some of us choose to live with them, others let them fester until they consume everything in their path." Her eyes lingered on Victor once more before shifting to Lady Eleanor, who flinched under the scrutiny. "The question now," Locke continued, "is what you do with the truth that remains." A heavy silence followed. Lady Eleanor inhaled sharply, straightening her spine, her aristocratic poise returning, though it could not mask the unease beneath. "This house will never be the same," she whispered. "None of us will." Victor turned from the window at last, his gaze finding Locke's. "And what of Henry?" Locke tilted her head slightly, considering. "The law will judge him, but history will not be kind. His name will be whispered in these halls long after we are gone, and perhaps that is the truest punishment of all." The words settled over them like a final verdict, and in that moment, Ravenshade Manor seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight of its secrets lifting, if only slightly. As Locke turned toward the door, the night air rushing in to meet her, she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. The truth had been revealed, but as she stepped into the darkness beyond, she knew that the echoes of this night would linger, stretching into the years to come, whispering through the corridors of a house that would never truly be free. The estate of Blackthorn Hollow lay beneath a shroud of silence, its vast corridors echoing with the ghosts of an unraveling past. The night air hung thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth, the sky a restless canvas of rolling storm clouds that had borne witness to the evening's terrible revelations. The fire in the study burned low, embers crackling softly, as the heavy velvet drapes stirred with the wind from the open window, where Dorian Blackthorn stood, his posture stiff, his hands gripping the sill, as if steadying himself against the weight of what had been exposed. He had spent years believing in the illusion of his family, his brother Elias, the golden heir, his father the unshakable patriarch, and himself the shadow between them. But tonight had torn through that facade like a blade through silk, and now all that remained were the jagged edges of the truth. Behind him, Inspector Thea Mercer watched the scene unfold with the practiced detachment of someone accustomed to seeing the hidden rot beneath polished exteriors. She had seen it all before. Secrets festered in silence, resentment curdled in the dark, and when the moment came, they erupted in violence. But even she had not anticipated the depth of the deception, nor the intricate design of the crime that had nearly gone unnoticed. It was never about justice, was it? She mused, her voice smooth but edged with steel. Elias didn't just want revenge. He wanted control. Across the room, Lord Blackthorne sat rigid in his chair, his fingers trembling slightly where they rested on the armrests. His face was ashen, the realization settling deep within him that his eldest son, the one he had favored above all, had orchestrated the cruelest betrayal. "I never saw it," he murmured. "I never imagined. You weren't meant to," Mercer said, stepping forward, her gaze sharp. "That was the brilliance of it. Elias played the long game, feeding the fractures within this family, deepening them until they became unbridgeable. And when the moment was right, he struck, first in whispers, then in blood." Dorian turned from the window, his jaw tight. "He poisoned him," he said quietly, his voice a mixture of fury and something deeper, something raw. "Elias poisoned my father, and made certain the blame would fall on me." Mercer gave a slow nod. "A plan years in the making. Every misstep, every doubt cast upon you, every moment of isolation, it was all calculated. The perfect crime doesn't require brute force, Mr. Blackthorne. It requires patience." The room was silent except for the distant rumble of thunder. Lady Eleanor, who had sat in stunned silence, now let out a shaky breath. "And what happens now?" Mercer glanced toward the door, where two constables stood waiting. "Now," she arched a brow, "now Elias Blackthorne faces the consequences of his ambition." There was no satisfaction in her voice, no triumph, only a quiet inevitability. The door opened, and the sound of footsteps filled the space. The last vestiges of defiance had long since drained from Elias's expression as he was led forward, his hands bound, his once pristine demeanor reduced to something hollow. His gaze flickered toward Dorian, one final, unreadable glance, before he was taken away. The house seemed to breathe as the doors closed behind him. The storm had passed, and yet, in its wake, a deeper reckoning remained. Dorian let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "He may be gone," he said, "but the damage is done." Mercer studied him for a long moment before speaking. "The truth always comes with a price, Mr. Blackthorne. The question is, are you willing to pay it?" No one answered, but the weight of the question lingered, threading itself into the very walls of Blackthorne Hollow, where secrets had been kept for far too long. The garden of Ravenshade Manor lay cloaked in twilight, its manicured hedges casting long distorted shadows beneath the waning moon. The scent of damp earth and fading roses clung to the air, a reminder that beauty, like truth, was fleeting. Evelyn Harrow sat alone on the stone bench at the garden's edge, her gloved fingers tracing the chilled surface as she stared toward the looming house, its grand facade an illusion of stability, masking the fractures within. The night had been long, its revelations heavier than the storm clouds that had once threatened rain. Now there was only the crisp hush of midnight, the silence of a house that had, for the first time in years, no more lies left to tell. Behind her, the crunch of gravel signaled another presence. Dorian Hale, his silhouette stark against the dim lantern glow. He moved with the cautious steps of a man burdened by understanding, his gaze heavy with the weight of knowing too much. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his voice low, "if the truth does more harm than good?" Evelyn turned slightly, regarding him with quiet intensity. "The truth doesn't destroy, Mr. Hale. Secrets do." he exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. Perhaps, but tonight, I watched a family collapse under the weight of it. His fingers curled at his sides, as if grasping at something intangible. Jonathan orchestrated every step of this, every deception, every carefully laid thread that led to his father's demise. And yet, he shook his head, his jaw tightening. I keep thinking, did we push too hard? Did we force something into the light that was better left buried? Evelyn studied him, her gaze unreadable. You give the dead too much power, she said at last. Jonathan may have been the architect of this ruin, but his father built the foundation long before him. A lifetime of cruelty, of silent manipulations and hidden betrayals. The truth didn't break this family, Dorian. It only revealed what had already been fractured. He let out a quiet, humorless laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. And now, she murmured, they pick up the pieces, or they let them scatter. That choice is theirs. Silence stretched between them, the kind that spoke of things left unsaid. The manor loomed behind them, its grand halls now devoid of pretense, its once pristine legacy forever tainted by what had transpired within its walls. There would be no reclaiming the past, no undoing what had been set in motion. Evelyn stood, the rustle of her coat barely a whisper against the night air. The truth never asks permission before it arrives, Mr. Hale, she said, her voice softer now. It only waits, patiently, until someone is ready to see it. He turned to look at her then, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Perhaps he understood, or perhaps, like the house behind them, he would need time to grasp the full weight of what had been unearthed. Either way, the night was silent now, and the garden for the first time in years was at peace.